Welcome again to our course on biodesign, strategies for innovation and design of bioengineering. Today we're going to take a look at regulatory strategies, so let's start. Alright, so for today I want you to understand the strategic risks and opportunities associated with PMAs and 510Ks. And if you remember, in our regulatory pathway basics, PMA and 510K are regulatory ways in which you can get approval or clearance of your products. I want you to consider how a global regulatory strategy can be integrated with an approach to the FDA to appreciate how and when to communicate with the FDA and fairly easily with other regulatory agencies all over the world, and to recognize common regulatory mistakes and learn how to avoid them. So if you remember a little bit of our clinical strategy phase in this course, I told you that there were very large difference between risks assessment, classification, and of course regulatory pathways. Here we are going to explain exactly what those differences are, which are also going to define your clinical strategy and your regulatory pathway. So in this case, 510Ks and PMAs are two regulatory pathways very different from each other. In terms of some variables, we can describe that devices of classification 1 and 2 are the most likely to receive a 510K regulatory pathway, while PMAs are reserved for class 3 devices. Submissions in 510K pathways are much more common than in PMAs, and actually there are 5,000 per year for 510K against 50 per year in the US for PMAs. The page count of a file of due diligence, clinical data, evidence, and everything that you have to submit to the FDA is in average 50 to 100 pages in a 510K application, while it could easily exceed 1,000 pages in a PMA application. The clinical hurdles, for example, for 510K applications are fairly small. In average, 10 to 15% of all 510K applications need clinical studies and the other may not need it. While in PMAs, all devices submitted need clinical studies, and many of which are lengthy and very costly. In terms of trial design, which also defines your clinical trial and clinical strategy plan, in 510K applications, if your device is class 1 or 2, may be non-randomized, small, 20 to 100 patients, non-control, and it could be fairly easy to perform. On the other side, if you have a class 3 device that you want to regulate and a PMA is required, then you must consider a design in which double-blinded, controlled, randomized, large clinical trials are required with, in average, more than 100 patients. The review period, for example, for a 510K is 90 days, while a PMA is double, and the application fee exceeds in the PMA to the 510K in a large scale. In this sense, a PMA can cost you up to $218,000 per application. Some of the pros and cons of these regulatory pathways are fairly easy to determine, but some of the most important is that the 510K can be defined as a cheaper, faster way of achieving regulatory approval than a PMA. Nonetheless, a PMA could have an advantage in terms of less competition, because everyone has to follow you through a PMA process, which again is lengthy and costly. And so if you have the resources and the IP to actually assure that what you're doing is going to be valuable on the long run, then a PMA might be a good option strategically. At the end of the day, the total biodesign cost that is estimated for a 510K, it's actually over $24 million, which could sound like a lot of money for one single medical device in an easy track. But think about what a PMA could cost you, which in average is estimated to be over $94 million. So again, your regulatory pathway should consider your R&D strategy and clinical strategy, because it needs to think and to consider the amount of resources and time you have in order to perform your goals. Okay, if we think about again to how the FDA traditionally looks at these products and how you have to approach this institution, well, it is important to consider that a meeting or subsequent meetings might be important, but also you have to realize that approaching the FDA in the wrong way might actually give you more troubles than the advantages that it may have. In this case, for traditional 510Ks, it is recommended not to have a pre-meeting, because if you do so, it may actually indicate the FDA that you don't have any idea what your product is capable of, or that you don't know a lot about your product, and you don't want to express that idea to the FDA. Nonetheless, in traditional 510K applications, you do need to do a first meeting of submission, and it could be required to do multiple subsequent meetings, but generally no. In problematic 510K applications, in which it is difficult to actually know if your device is substantially equivalent to another device, definitely a pre-meeting could be advantageous for you and the FDA. A meeting after submission is always important, and multiple subsequent meetings can also depend on if those problems have been resolved. And for PMAs, pre-meeting, meeting submission, and subsequent meetings are a must. So do them. Some of the most common errors when someone approaches the FDA are laid out in 8 different components. The first one is documentation errors. This is a very simple thing to avoid. Try to follow your quality system. Try to do all the documentation in the way it is laid out in the FDA website, and please try to be thorough on the way you express your ideas, synthetic, and that it makes sense. A lack of capability of actually transmitting that you have a clear idea of what your requirements are get you in a disadvantage in terms of formality and documentation towards the FDA. Another error is to pay no attention to the FDA document guidance that are displayed on the website. All the information that you require to have, it's probably in the FDA website. Though it is complex sometimes to explore this website, it is important for you to recognize that all the information is there, and so you don't want to ask questions that they have already answered in their webpage. Another common error is that you don't have a regulatory strategy in your design and development, and that you do not think about the things that you could do and that you want to do regulatory wise or clinical wise when you develop your product. As such, it is required throughout this course that you try to keep it simple as possible, so that your regulatory requirements met with a simplicity in design that might lead you to a very fast track approval. Another very common error is to do unnecessarily complex submissions. This is something really interesting, because people tend to sometimes provide very extensive data and information and due diligence package in an attempt to actually confuse the FDA so that they don't revise thoroughly your submissions. And that actually causes the opposite effect. It makes the FDA get confused and actually look more thoroughly and more skeptically at your data and at your submission, so you don't want to do unnecessary complex submission of documents. Keep it simple. Try to do at least possible submissions as possible, and to be as clear as you could possibly be. And a following error is poor communication with the reviewer. You have to think and acknowledge that the FDA is there to help you, and also they just want to ensure that something that you're trying to commercialize is safe and effective for the public, which is something that you supposedly want to. And so just try to communicate as extensively as possible with the reviewer in a very accommodated and nice manner, so that you can, get to have a good relationship with the agency in all your process. Finally, there are failure to anticipate reviewer questions, in which it's very important for you to acknowledge that you may think prior to the meetings of any questions that they might ask you, and have in your pocket sort of the answers to those questions. That actually puts you in a very good position towards the FDA, and makes them believe that you know what you're talking about, which is supposedly what you have to do. And finally, the lack of correspondence between marketing claims and approval is something really common. Of course, companies want to have the easiest regulatory pathway as possible, but they want to have the most broader, extensive claims possible too. And that's something that it's mutually exclusive sometimes. And so try to do or to justify the best correspondence as possible for all this process. So if you want very large, very extensive claims on the use of your device, you should expect to have more due diligence on the submissions that you do. Finally, the most important idea from all this regulatory strategy is expressing this cartoon, right? It says, all I can tell you is don't try to pet this the wrong way, and don't try to pet the FDA the wrong way would be the most important thing to take from this presentation. As such, try to think in simplicity when thinking on R&D and clinical strategies so that your submissions for FDA are simple too. And with this, we have concluded our regulatory strategy phase. My name is Luis Sorensen. Thank you for watching, and please refer yourself to our biodesign course book if you have any other questions regarding this topic. Thank you.